Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us now and later for Confronting the Myth of Neutrality, Academic Libraries, Advocacy, and Free Speech. My name is Alyssa Denler. I'll be the moderator for this session today. And I'd like to start off by just introducing our presenters who we're so fortunate to have with us here today, or our panelists rather. First is Emily Knox. Emily is currently the Interim Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Also with us today, we have Renata Chancellor. Renata is the chair and an associate professor at Catholic University of America. Then we have Stacy Collins joining us. Stacy is a research and instruction librarian at Simmons University. And finally, we have Adrian Lim, who is the Dean of the University Libraries at the University of Maryland. So thank you so much again for joining us. For today's session, we will have a series of questions related to this topic of free speech in libraries. I'd like to start off with the first question and give the presenters just a moment to contemplate, and then I will start with Emily to give her thoughts on this. So, as we know, libraries are not neutral spaces. So what is our role in these conversations, and how does this apply to supporting marginalized students who are often targeted or left to fend for themselves in free speech debates on campus?
I think there are a couple of different ways of looking at that. I'm really not a fan of the term free speech. I think it focuses too much on issues that are highly charged and political. I'm much more a fan of the term freedom of expression, which is what I think libraries support as a whole. And this encompasses much more than necessarily what people are saying. It has to do with ideas that are circulating in the world. It has to do with artwork. It has to do with writing. It's much more expansive than that. So when I think about what libraries' roles are, I don't necessarily think that libraries' roles are to ensure that everything that is on the shelf is something that will never bring harm to anybody. I don't think that that is the library's role. And I often worry that that is what some people think the library's role is. So when I think about what the library's role is, it's much more to think about how do we frame this debate, right? How do we make sure that the best ideas are getting out there? But what the best idea is changes over time. So just saying that, we only have ideas that are acceptable to people who are living in, late pandemic United States on the East Coast is not necessarily what a library is charged to do. I think that working through what is the right thing for supporting people who are underrepresented or marginalized in some way can often be very difficult work. But it is only by making ideas that are sometimes that were unacceptable at a previous time available that we can actually work towards supporting people today.
Thank you so much. Renata, if you don't mind.
Sure, and thank you for having me. Just to kind of pick up on what Emily was saying, I wholeheartedly agree. I do think we need to frame the debate as not so much as what is the role of the library, because I think often we know that libraries are institutions, but I think it's more about the information. It's connecting users to information. So regardless of what that information is, that is what the whole point of the library. Now, historically, the library has always been a question as to what was the role of the library. But we have evolved with society, and we can't separate what's going on in the nation, in the world, from what's going on or its impact on libraries, because it all affects libraries. It generally affects all American public institutions. Libraries are one example of that. People who come into the library represent all different, a diverse group of individuals, backgrounds, ethnicities, genders. And so while it is somewhat noble when the profession was founded was to have an institution that can be open and free to everyone, that has never, ever been the case. And so I like to move away from this whole discussion as to should libraries be neutral? Because quite frankly, they never really have been neutral. And I think we need to think about how we want to position libraries today. And when we think about libraries as an institution, we also need to think about the people who come to these institutions. And so in terms of helping marginalized individuals or people who represent a representative of the I guess the emerging majority in the United States, it's important for those who work in libraries, library workers, to understand that their collections, their services, how they do programming needs to be reflective of the community. And so I think once you do that, and once if libraries can embrace that notion, then that's going to impact, and that may minimize the hate that goes on with individuals that you find on campuses, where there's hate crimes or there's other incidents on campus that occur. So I think libraries should be more proactive in that regard.
Stacy, I'd love to hear your thoughts next, if you don't mind. And thank you so much, Renata, and it's great to have you as well.
Do like that as we get started, we're being asked if we mind to speak. It's nice. And no, I don't. So I agree with Emily. I agree with Renata. I think at the core of this question is the idea of how do we not be neutral? But as Renata just said, we've never been neutral. This is really about addressing the fact that we have been extremely one-sided, because by failing to examine, by sort of failing to embed and make structural change, we support particular cultural aspects by default. That's how they work. That's how the systems work. So by starting to examine that, by starting to ask the questions of, how has systemic racism, systemic oppression of any kind impacted and shaped the library up until now, is where you start, as you start answering that question, you start then seeing changes to the library itself. I think another important question is how, and this sort of is an extension of what Renata just said, of how the library can be positioned to support liberation, to push liberation forward as opposed to supporting oppression. I also agree that it's not, I don't think the library's role is to mitigate harm between information and the community. One, it sucks agency out of the community. And if anything, libraries are here to promote the agency of our communities. It is our purpose to connect our community to the information that they are seeking. There are opportunities for curation. There are opportunities for helping to shape engagement with information, with programming, and with the kinds of, really programming, the kind of programming and education that's offered through the library about how you access information, and our transparency about how we do what we do is another way to do that. But saying, you'll never find anything offensive in our library is silly, because of course you will. You absolutely will. And libraries can't take over being, the social conscious for publishing, or the entirety of the nation or the world as it produces information through systems. But actually, I think transparency is maybe my answer to this question. I do think libraries have a responsibility for mitigating harm against that librarians experience within librarianship. I think that's a different conversation. And I think transparency about things like how we describe things, description, classification, how we make things accessible, and the idea that information is never coming out of nothingness. It's not being produced in a vacuum. It's being produced by systems that are underpinned by money, underpinned by other systems that privilege certain voices and silence others. And that transparency and that kind of way of, again, helping to shape folks' engagement with information that they're seeking is how you raise consciousness, if that's sort of what you're after, but it's also simply part of the job. And again, as we start incorporating part of the job, if we start incorporating this idea of how do we support liberation, how do we stop being non-neutral in a particular direction and actually sort of approach counter narratives and that kind of support, that sort of naturally follows in the work that's being done.
Absolutely. And I think finally we have Adrian.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I love listening to all of the comments so far. I think I took this in a slightly different direction when I was reflecting on the questions. I recalled reading an essay several years ago by Peter Johann Lohr, I believe is how he pronounces it, in Library Trends. And in Lohr's essay, he noted that throughout time, the deliberate burning of libraries happened even in peacetime democracies. And he noted that the targeting of libraries occurred when a society was fracturing along divisions, religious, ethnic, racial, sociological, ideological. And he went on to explore the ways that the targeting of libraries might not always be a violent act like burning down a building, but also could come in the form of extreme budget cuts or of neglect within a community, and that might have the same long-term effects of a burning. I thought the article was important for this discussion because in his essay, he was conceptualizing libraries falling into a political spectrum of being more or less visible, from on one side of the spectrum being more marginalized or even extinct or absent, to being on the other side of the spectrum very highly seen as prestigious and an important part of society. And then for librarians, that spectrum also exists from being apathetic functionaries on one end to being technocrats, believing technology solves everything, for example, in the middle, to being social justice activists at the other end. And so these questions you asked made me remember this article. It was about 5 years ago or so that I read it, that there are inherent political and existential risks to us. The more that we try, not just us as institutions, but I mean individually too, when we try to take on a more visible and activist stance. And I think it's good to remember those risks going forward. And I'm convinced that we must move toward a more activist stance, a more visible stance, especially now in more polarized times as they increasingly get more polarized. We're also educators, and we have stated values, not that we've always lived up to them, but if we want to align with our stated values, we have to take a more activist stance, or else we risk diminishing our roles, and we risk the decreasing of the relevance of the library in our communities. So I think we should support all students in a holistic way, but we can never, I think Emily was alluding to this too, we can never really take away all the risks of harm or damage when our students, for example, become more visible and more activists themselves, especially when they are without power in society. But we can make sure that they feel supported and seen and heard. We can make our events, our spaces, our services as inclusive as possible, and our collections. And we can support them by having meaningful statements and banners and whatever it takes to help them know they are not alone. I know that some people think that's performative, but I really think they are meaningful symbols, even along with all the other work we could do, of course, but to help people know that they're supported. And again, I think that we need to amplify their voices through our collections, our events, and so forth. And then when it comes down to supporting the members of our community that feel they are under attack, who are under attack at times, and who have less power.
Thank you. I appreciate with all of your answers this, starting with this very passive word neutral and moving it to this space of you need to, move forward and liberation and support and everything like that. I really appreciate that reframing and pushing back on that language. Related to that would be our second question, which is how can libraries involve students in helping to make their voices heard in providing a safe space to study and exist? What is the right balance of work to ensure the labor is not shifted to those experiencing free speech challenges? And I can already see and hear words that you will like to reframe, which I'm looking forward to. Emily?
So I guess one thing I would say is I don't think education is ever safe. The process of educating is actually to make someone a different person. In many ways, education is a type of violence. And sometimes people get on me about saying that, but I like to talk about not myself, but my father, who was a first generation college graduate, and how much different he is from his family who were not able to attend college for various reasons. The act of becoming, of going to school, of being, of learning about things that are not the same as where you come from, right? That's actually what we think about when we think about education in this country, is actually to make you a different person. It can rarely be safe. And so I'm always a little worried when I hear about safety. There's one thing about physical safety, but it's inevitable that in the process of becoming educated, that you will encounter ideas and concepts that will go against your received knowledge, whatever that might be. So what libraries can do is to make sure that that is a process that is not as violent as it possibly can be, right? So libraries provide quiet spaces for people. They provide group spaces for people. They provide the information that people need to encounter these difficult ideas. They can provide spaces for people to debate these ideas. But the idea that somehow becoming educated will not be difficult, and in some ways, really pull you through to be a different person at the end, it's just not something that education can do. And it is often more difficult for people who are underrepresented in some way, because you are both encountering ideas that are that can be harmful to you as a person, right? How do you respond when that happens? But also ideas that might be different from something that you heard previously. I guess I don't know that it is the work of higher education to ensure that there will not be difficulty in the process. I'm really curious to hear what other people have to say.
Oh, yeah, please go ahead, Renata. I don't need to say your names every time.
Okay, all right, great. I think that was interesting, Emily, and I agree as well. And I feel that what education does do, it does force you to think critically about these things and how you respond. And that can often be dangerous to a person of color. If you're at a predominantly white institution and you are a person of color in the classroom and you are hearing lectures from faculty that you may or may not agree with, that you may or may challenge, you are going to, you're going to be looked upon, or you're going to be, you're not going to feel comfortable to speak up. I recall when I was in working on my undergraduate degree, I was at a predominantly white institution, and I was the only Black person taking a then Afro-American history course. And I remember the professor talking about how Blacks are represented in the media and primarily through sports and through acting. And I recall challenging him, and being the only Black person in the class, challenging him, and kind of like the fire that I got from him. But I'm just always the type that I'm going to speak up no matter what when I see that there's something that's not right. And I found, and I feel that also it was an opportunity to educate my fellow classmates. I feel libraries can also provide that as well. In the same breadth of vein of providing information to users, you want to provide all that information that's available out there. And it's not going to always be pretty. It's not always going to be good, but it's important for us to at least have that information out there. I think there are two good models when we think about libraries being so-called safe, because I agree libraries are probably not really, I mean, there are spaces where we would like for it to be safe to have these ideas, and we do provide these spaces for discussion and things like that. But I would like to provide two great models, I believe, that are in the public library arena. One is, you guys are probably very familiar with Ferguson, when there was protests going on in Ferguson years ago, and the whole city shut down, but the library was open to have students come in and to have education and to find resources about how they can survive during this protest. The same thing with Baltimore a couple years after that, in 2017, I believe, when they made the decision to open or keep the Enid Pratt Library open so that people can come in and get information. So there are models for libraries to look at in terms of providing space for people to come in and get information, but I also like to caution us to know that there's probably on any university campus, there's probably going to be, you're not going to be 100% safe.
I think I understand Renata is finished. Stacy, if you have thoughts, I'd love to hear them as well. I'm sure you have thoughts, and I would love to hear them.
I do have thoughts. There's no way to be around Emily and Renata and not have thoughts. Good Lord. And what I'm now, it's got me thinking, like, we've sort of been playing with the idea of safety at all. And it's got me wondering if safety is the opposite of vulnerability, because what Emily has just said is it's not, and even if it were, it's something we couldn't promise, that the act of education is an act of vulnerability, the willingness to open up to the possibility of a new worldview, at the very least to be exposed to it, even if it doesn't shift your own. That's most certainly a state of vulnerability. I think maybe the difference is like consensual vulnerability versus forced vulnerability. Because yes, I mean, you can have folks who come to an educational institution, this of course be in particularly for academic libraries, but folks who come to an educational institution expecting to sort of be challenged, but do they expect that, they expect to have to sort of take on that vulnerability in every single space. And so like sitting in your library's group study room with your study group, you're reading about something that you've never heard of before, some aspect of history that you had no idea about, and perhaps it's yours, perhaps it's your history, and you had no idea, because systems are not built to tell you your history until you get to this level of education, which is itself inaccessible to many. And that is one experience of maybe not quite safety in the library, but that is different, I think, than being a trans person who is looking for information about yourself and your community and your history, or that's the history of this particular aspect of your identity, and finding not only sources that answer that question for you and provide that information, but then also sources that are violent in their way, even if they are historical and were acceptable at the time. The co-location of things that that undermine sort of the safety of your identity, and the idea that you were not prepared to take on that vulnerability by simply stepping into the stacks to look for information. Same thing in a very different way of, you know, folks who might have a physical disability who enter the stacks looking for a book and then find that part of retrieving that book requires them to go back to the desk and find a person who can get it off the shelf for them. That's a vulnerability that I don't think people are agreeing to sign on for in the library space. And it can be addressed, systemically addressed, instead of sort of, as the question says, leaving folks out of the loop without, you know, to not taking their perspective, and therefore we leave these spaces of unsafety, lack of safety there. I think it can be addressed. The question of how we involve students makes me immediately think of zines. Zine librarians are incredible humans, and the act of incorporating zines, especially community created zines, into collections is one way that you get a lot of input from the community itself as to how they would describe their work, how they would describe issues that they see. And in my library, our zine collection has actually allowed us to create and use local subject headings, right, which helps resist some things that are passed down from Library of Congress and whatnot. These are ways that the students are actually reshaping the library, and we make them aware of that as best we can. But it's no fun, right? It's sitting in an information literacy workshop or class and finding out how much of your worldview has been shaped by the systems that create information that are owned by like 5 people. And then figuring out that the way to get to sort of push back against it ends up having to take on a lot of that labor yourself. So the second part of this question of how do we make sure that the labor isn't being borne by the people who are already actively being harmed and already having to take on vulnerability more often, I guess is the way to say it. How do we make sure that they don't have this extra labor? And I think it does come back to transparency. I think it comes back to education, and I think it comes back to systemic and structural change. But it has to be with input from the community, because a community that doesn't recognize how their lack of safety is sort of culminating in spaces in the library, among resources in the library, among librarians in the library. It's not going to be something that can be fixed until they know that they know how it's happening. Yeah.
Adrian, I suppose it is just easiest if I call it names. I feel like I'm in a classroom or something, but I'd love to hear from you as well.
Sometimes I forget the order, so it is helpful at times to hear the name, but thank you. Well, I was thinking as other panelists were talking about how I agree with everything in regard to when you confront some very new concepts or things that shake your paradigms and rock your world. But when I think about some of the experiences that more marginalized groups have gone through, it's really about that what they're encountering is their own proposed dehumanization. And that is where and that goes to Stasia's statement about vulnerability. But when you're encountering it over and over again, I come from the perspective of an LGBTQ community member. And I recently reminded somebody, if I had to tell you and count how many times I heard about marrying one's golden retriever in meetings, and how you had to sit there and listen to it in the spirit of a debate, let's say. That is something you can avoid, I know, when you go to a university, perhaps. But again, it's how many times you encounter it over and over, your dehumanization. So I think there are ways that, and it's calling upon libraries to understand these power differentials. And it is fair for us to say that we would support members of our community, students, who are unfairly being targeted for that dehumanization. And there are many ways we can do that. Some of them have already been described by other panelists, but I wanted to focus instead on the policy side of things. We are, most of us, members of the academic community. Some of us have power and privilege. We're faculty members with tenure, et cetera, and we belong to shared governance groups like senates and so forth, committees. And when policies are being brought up and new paradigms for diversity education, I'm thinking too of recent policies enacted across the nation about time, manner, and place policies that are trying to regulate expressive activity on our campuses. How involved are the libraries, librarians, and library workers in those debates on our campus? I think that they can be used to penalize our students for speaking out, and we know if there is a power differential, students who are speaking out on some of these issues are definitely, worried and or experiencing penalties for that in ways that those with more privilege are not. And so I think at the policy level, for one thing, I want to add to the contribution to the conversation, we should be involved in those conversations, expressing our values there, and trying to be advocates for those in our community who have less power.
Thank you so much. I have so many things I am thinking about, but nothing articulate at the moment, except that we do have one more question on our list, and then we will have a little bit of time at the end if attendees or if you have questions for each other. For our third one, how can libraries balance our professional ethics with university administrative goals and policies that may be in opposition? And have you ever experienced a conflict in this area? And if so, how did you resolve it? And actually, this is a great one to come right back to Adrienne as you were just speaking to this.
Well, and in this case, I guess I've been conflicted about this one to some degree. It might sound like a cop-out, but I keep thinking that it has to be almost case by case, because the analysis has to be at that moment. Can you afford to take a risk? It could be a blowback to you, your career, your library, your institution. And versus the benefits, your ability to speak out at any given time, et cetera. I know that sounds like maybe a cop-out to some, but I can give you a few examples where we did speak out to the benefit. For example, at one university where I worked, a multi-million-dollar donor wanted to give the libraries a gift, a huge monetary gift. But as a condition of that gift, they wanted us to install a permanent kiosk that, presented Ayn Rand's objectivism in the lobby of the library. The university had a campaign going at the time. It would have really loved that multi-million-dollar gift, but we spoke out against it. We objected to it. People were trying to pressure us. Oh, well, it's not that bad. The donors were saying, don't you have other progressive propaganda laying around the library? And they meant things like the New York Times and things like that. But we resisted. It helped that we had tenure at the time. But I do think it cost us politically, and maybe even me politically at the time. But eventually the campus came around and said these demands are unreasonable. Another example where it wasn't so, I have misgivings about it some days, but on another campus, the denaming of some buildings was happening. The Black Student Union was demanding that the name be removed of a former professor of the university, but as somebody who was also a grand cyclops in the KKK in the early 20th century. And so at the time, many of us spoke out against the name, in other words, for the denaming, but we didn't take a public stance at the time. Not much later, the university commissioned a study, and the libraries was a leader in that study to try to look through archives, look through data, help the commission try to come up with all the arguments for and against denaming. And I remember thinking at the time, well, I'm kind of glad we didn't make a public stance, because all sides of it You know, people were on all sides of that debate. And they saw us, I believe, as kind of not neutral, I understand, but at least somewhat, you know, we hadn't come to a conclusion. We hadn't made a public statement. This is where I have my misgivings. In the end, it turned out well, meaning the report was issued, the decision was made to dename the building. And I felt that the libraries had gained, you know, a lot of trust in the community around that. But I have misgivings that we should have been more activist at the time. So these things are not always, you know, clear. And so I think each one of us has to make that choice. And hopefully we make the right choices, but sometimes we just have to learn from our mistakes.
Absolutely, a lot of nuance in both of those situations, and the examples are both terrifying and expected to hear, I suppose, unfortunately. I'll come backwards to Stacy as well.
This is one of those uncomfy questions, if any of them have been comfy, but the reality that the library, any library, exists at among intersecting political landscape and intersecting political interests of all kinds of politicalism, I guess, is something that it's a physical reality, it's a monetary reality, it's a job security reality. And I, you know, as Adrienne was speaking, I was thinking of not fellow librarians, but faculty that I've heard talk about holding back on some of the things that they are ardently in support of or ardently against, and keeping sort of a quieter space, doing their talking behind closed doors to a certain extent, right? It's happening in office hours, maybe it's happening in their classroom, but it's not happening right on the quad among the student protests and that kind of thing. And the reasoning is doing it now becomes a barrier to me getting tenure. And when I get tenure, I have far more freedom, again, around security, of being able to do this kind of speaking out and this kind of advocacy. And it's not untrue, right? It's not untrue. Now, there's a conversation to be had about a de-radicalizing that tenure may or may not have, depending on who you are, or, you know, where, again, the political landscape in which you have to operate. But it doesn't take away from the truth, the reality of that folks in secure positions that already hold some amount of power are in a position to be more vocal, radical advocates. The problem, of course, is that if you're in that position, what is the likelihood that you are? But I've had the great fortune of working at a library, at an institution where nothing the library has taken on as of yet has been in direct opposition to anything that the university decided to dig their heels in about and say, you cannot do this, or absolutely not. But at the same time, there are things that we have had to be, like any department, have to be nuanced in our request for funds to do, have to be nuanced in, or what is it, the forgiveness instead of permission sort of approach of, oh yeah, we're gonna quietly remove this, the name of such and such person. And we have reasons that we could argue about, like how different, you know, the fund that they set up has depleted or whatever, even if that's not the actual like values centered reason why it's gone. But so the idea that libraries are powerful, that we have power, is true, but we are not all powerful. A public library that takes a stance at every single opportunity is no doubt going to lose support among a town council, perhaps, or a board that ultimately makes decisions for the library, both in terms of who is in charge of it, how it is funded, absolutely, and what kind of reach it can have within the community. And navigating that is just as important as navigating the needs of your community, the needs that perhaps your community isn't even aware that they have, that sort of conversation. And in an academic world, you really are. I mean, we are librarianship as a system, but we are also intersecting with the system of higher education, which was built on the premise that education, one, exists in a hierarchy, and two, only some folks are going to make it to the top. And as much as that has shifted and adjusted and expanded, there are core tenets of it. And at the bottom of it, a college is, well, no, I won't say at the bottom of it, amongst all the things that a college and a university is, it is a business that has to survive. And things that represent a liability to that are things that get squashed, I guess, in their way. So I don't have concrete advice for what to do in this in that situation. I think it is, I don't think it sounds like a cop-out. I think it sounds like reality, that it has to be taken case by case. Even if there is discussion about a line in the sand that you're unwilling to cross, you're still going to have to see, is this that line? Have we come to that line? Yeah.
So there is this book by Mary Douglas called How Institutions Think. It's a little small book, and I love the book because I read it years ago when I was working on my PhD. And in the book, she talks about how universities function, how it's hard to make change, how these systems, how these systems operate, basically. And so it gets me to thinking about my university, where I'm at a university where there is politics that are there, and very hard, long entrenched policies that are hard to kind of penetrate. So I work at a university, but I work at a private university. I work at a religious university. So I have this double layer. I have this institution of university and this institution of this religious Catholic faith. So I have a double dose. And so when I think about the challenges of free speech on a campus where it's we're told that really the First Amendment doesn't really work there, doesn't matter there, because we're a private university and we can do whatever we want to do, basically, because we're beholden to the bishops or whatever. So I think about those complexities, and I think about it makes me think about the challenges for students, not only just for me as a faculty just trying to navigate the space, but also for students and for users in the library. Now, the library does have a collection where it does have multiple perspectives, but it's very limited. So, so imagine being in a university environment where you're going to be at a religious institution and you're going to be limited to the resources that are available to you. I think the role is I think the librarians who work there, the information professionals who work there, they are even more challenged, right? Because their role is to impart this information. And so I think it's important for them to push that information out, the information out as impartial as possible. Or I don't mean impartial, I meant from the various perspectives as possible. Basically not to really, how should I censor the information that they might if they were part of the institution. So I think our librarians at our university do a really good job at being very critical about collections and gathering materials from all different perspectives. But I do think there are universities whereby that is not being done adequately or appropriately. That being said, I do think if you are an administrator at a university, and I agree with one of the panelists who said earlier about we are pretty much in a privileged space whereby I'm the chair of my department, I participate in these faculty meetings and these dean's meetings, and I can speak up, but my voice is only going to go so far. And I think a lot of times the librarians at these universities underestimate voice that they have, because the library it's very central to the university. Everybody, all the administrators love the library, right? And so I think we as information professionals or librarians need to use their voice more, and to be willing to speak up to their dean or to their president about some of the challenges that are out there. I don't think that's done enough, but I think that's something that should be done. And I think that just helps everyone all around.
So I think I'll just speak to policy more broadly. The question about tension is interesting to me. Policies provide a structure, but they don't give you an answer. I think a lot of times people want policy to give an answer. What it can also do is help your procedures be more transparent, so that you can demonstrate to people that you are thinking through whatever has come before the library, and that decisions are not being made on the fly. I think what a lot of people worry about is that they are not being heard and that they are not being taken seriously. So what a policy can do is to ensure that people are heard, even if your outcome does not match what they want. So to me, that is the goal. And it doesn't mean that people will be happy with you, but it also protects the institution and the librarians themselves to say, we are following policy to have good minutes and all of those sorts of things. I think a lot of these things get lost because there is so much tension around, some of the issues that libraries are grappling with right now. So, I really encourage my students to, when they get a new job, to look through all the policies, to make sure that if they are in leadership roles, that they review their policies on a regular basis, to let them know that sometimes they will have to write them policies themselves, but those policies should be vetted, right? And they should be approved by whatever group does the approving. And it's really to provide a process, right? To make sure that you have listened, right? That you are thinking through what is the best thing, not just for me, not just even for the people who are upset in front of me, but for the institution as a whole. Are we actually embodying our mission and what we need to do as part of the larger academic institution? So I think that there will always be tensions. I do talk to, in my role when I teach intellectual freedom and censorship, I talk to my students about how there will be tensions between their policies, their personal ethics, their professional ethics. There's really no way around that, but what you can do is talk through them. Make sure that you are not necessarily making these decisions alone. I often worry that people make these decisions alone. And even be explicit about why you are making a decision, how you came to this decision, who you talked to, what you were thinking about. I think sometimes that is good also, to let people sometimes see how the sausage gets made in the back. I know that's probably not the best metaphor to use there. So I think that's how I would answer that question. I'm kind of a policy junkie. I get worried when I see that libraries don't have good policy or haven't updated their policies in 10 years. That's always a problem. So this is just something that I think about quite a bit.
Thank you. So I think something I've heard in more and more in recent years is, I'm reading, I'm listening, I'm learning. And what I'm hearing from you all is, okay, you're here, you have this knowledge, you have this education, take that somewhere, go, like Renata said, wow, completely lost train of thought there, but just thinking like, what can I do? I'm junior faculty, but like there's a voice, you can use it, you can go up and take it elsewhere and send that communication. So thank you so much again for all of your thoughts. It's been wonderful hearing from you all. And what I'm not positive is how much time we have for audience questions. I'm tired of hearing my own voice, but I do have one if others don't. Another theme I was hearing is kind of this almost carrot of funding being tied to freedom of expression in libraries. And some of you are in administration, some of you are not. So I would just kind of love to hear more about that, thoughts and experiences that you've had. And I'll just call on anyone who looks excited to speak. Emily, you looked a little excited there.
So I'm not an administrator for this, but I should just say that I have heard some quite horrifying stories about people, similar to what Adrian said, about people using the library and using money as a way of in some ways manipulating the library to support their own position. So that's really I think a major concern. Also, it's one that I think that people are not necessarily anticipating will happen when they start their job. So when Adrian told her story, and I'd like to hear more, I reminded myself that I need to bring this up more as I'm teaching my courses.
Thank you for that question. Thank you, Emily. May I jump in just to say that it's part of the other system overall that libraries don't have enough money to do their jobs. Let's remember that. And that public education was being defunded for decades now. At the same time, all these regulatory and things started coming on to us about assessing and evaluating to the nth degree everything we did, and we had less resources to do it. So it does affect the libraries in the end. And then universities, by becoming, de facto privates. I did have to say, wow, I didn't realize so many of the panelists worked at private institutions. But in a way, I've worked at public institutions that really were almost barely surviving if it were not for philanthropic, wealthy donors. And so that's the reality we live in right now. Sometimes I keep thinking if we really wanted to help libraries at any of our institutions, we should all be out on the streets advocating and marching for good public education and public institutions and the commons. But more and more, we heard today, Web of Science, Clarivate, they're, more and more monopolistic for-profit companies are infiltrating our world. And so, yes, I agree with Renata, speak out. We need to use our voices and our pens, our computers, to write an advocacy for the things we care about. Without that, I really do, I fear for the future of libraries if we don't make more progress in these areas.
So this is kind of the opposite of the, withholding the carrot of wealth. It's dangling it in front of institutions. And yes, a much wider conversation.
Oh, well, all I was going to say was that this policy comes into play because, yes, I agree this is happening across many of our institutions, but I would wonder how many of us are developing policies to help us address this question from this point going forward even. And the other looming question is, sometimes wealthy people are really wonderful, great people. I've met many of them. On the other hand, some should not be honored just because they have a lot of money. And so how are we developing our policies around philanthropy and donors? in our institutions? It's a good question. Sorry, I don't have any other answers.
Any last hands I'm missing? Thank you for pointing that out.
This doesn't answer the question. I think it only adds more of a problem, but I can't help also thinking about like, right, like Mitch McConnell, other wealthy people, they don't have, you know, printing presses in their basements. They didn't like create the money. The money came from somewhere. They profited off of something. And my question would be, do the folks who are supposed to be on the receiving end of the money, do they know where that came from? To the point where they can say like, oh, this, you know, this doesn't profit off of things like prison labor or things that like are actively like harming the global community, et cetera, et cetera. And again, it doesn't answer the question, but it's maybe another question to ask to help shape an answer. Yeah.
I am going to put a pin in it here for the sake of the recording. To those watching from afar, thank you for tuning in, and our presenters, we appreciate your candid answers so very much.